I speak publicly through several different mediums every day of my life. And you might think that those who wish to be outraged by my comments would find more than enough new fodder every day to keep them satiated. But somehow that is not the case. The outrage mob demands even more reasons to be mad at me. And so they will not only sift through my daily comments, but they'll also dig through everything I've said over the past 10 years to find more ammunition. And this creates a situation where nearly every day I have factions of the outrage mob screaming at me because of things I said that day, and then I have other factions screaming at me arbitrarily over something I said years ago. So they'll come banging on my door, metaphorically, shouting, "Hey, remember this thing you said on September 14th, 2016? And I'll say, no, I actually don't. That was a long time ago. What are you talking about? And they'll say, well, here's what you said, and you said it, and we're mad about it 7 years later. And I'll say, okay, well, have fun with that, I guess. I don't know what to do for you. And then I'll go about my day. That's usually the way it works. But every once in a while, this randomly reignited outrage provides me with an opportunity to revisit or expand upon an important point. And that's what happened yesterday when, for some reason, my Twitter mentions became filled with people upset over something that I tweeted on March 8th, 2018. And here's the offending tweet. This was me. Video games are a sacred cow because our country is filled with adults who are obsessed with them. That's why we all pretend insanely that there's nothing wrong with or disturbing about a child spending all day killing people in a virtual world. Shocking stuff. Apparently in 2018, I made the provocative claim that children shouldn't spend all day playing violent video games. Lots of people apparently disagree. They, I guess, think that children should spend all day playing violent video games. I mean, I could see a response where you say, well, no kids spending all day playing violent video games. But to respond like you disagree with the statement is another thing entirely, but that's what happened. Now, part of the reason why people dig up old tweets is that it gives them, or they believe it gives them, a rhetorical advantage because they can pluck one statement from the past, completely remove it from the broader context and conversation it was a part of, ignore everything else I may have said about that subject at the time to flesh out my views, and instead they can engage with this one statement as if it was made in a void. It's a clever way to make a straw man out of somebody's argument, even while quoting them directly. It may be a correct quote, like I did say that, but it's only one part of a larger thought. And the larger thought is lost, leaving only the one single piece that you have isolated. For an example of how this works, here's what a guy named George Alexopoulos, who has a relatively large social media following apparently, here's what he tweeted at me yesterday in response to my tweet from 5 years ago. He said, quote, "Video games are a medium, not a genre, you bearded puritanical Philistine. If your child is only playing games where he's murdering people, get educated and buy him Minecraft, Rocket League, Mario Maker. Better yet, play games together and bond. Debate me, Matt." He wants to debate me about this point from 5 years ago. Now, I'm aware that non-violent video games exist. However, in that one particular statement 5 years ago, I was specifically talking about violent video games, which also exist. Yes, violent video games are a genre, and I was talking about that genre. Okay? So just because I'm talking about one thing in particular, it doesn't mean that I'm denying that other things also exist. It's just that this is what I'm talking about right now, or what I was talking about 5 years ago. There was much more straw manning where that came from. The Quartering tweeted, quote, "The right's weird obsession with disavowing video games, anime, and social media is why they will never appeal to most of Gen Z. The base is literally dying off, and most of the voices in the community are actively refusing recruits." Well, with all due respect to Jeremy from the Quartering, I think it's safe to say that I have recruited more people into conservatism than he ever has or ever will. I do sometimes, I have to admit, get a little bit tired of hearing lectures on effectiveness from people who are far less effective. Like at a certain point, these people need to maybe take a second, realize that maybe you could learn something. Okay, maybe you could learn something from people who are achieving more than you are in this fight. Possibly. People are raving about Genucel products. For example, you might remember Jacob the PA from my YouTube series where I was forced to play video games. I played against Jacob in a game of Mortal Kombat, and I completely annihilated him. Well, I ran into Jacob in the hall the other day, and I was taken aback by how sickly and tired he looked. I'm obviously an incredibly caring person, so of course I asked if he was okay, thinking maybe he still hasn't recovered from the complete embarrassment of a middle-aged man beating him. Well, turns out Jacob just hasn't been sleeping at all over the last few days because he's been binge playing the new Star Wars game that came out. Now, I was not only repulsed by his face, but also repulsed by him completely, by everything about him, an utter disgrace. And unfortunately, I can't cure all the things that ail him, but I can at least cure the disgusting, hideous appearance of his face with Genucel. Nothing works like Genucel. It's a family recipe that's been perfected over 20 years. Genucel promises immediate effects. You'll see results in 12 hours guaranteed or your money back. Jacob did indeed see immediate results and he couldn't be happier, at least so I hear, since he's no longer allowed to be in my presence. But I hear that he's slightly less repulsive at this point. If you don't want to look disgusting, try Genucel's most popular package for 70% off at genucel.com/Walsh. All orders are upgraded to free shipping, and every subscription order includes a complimentary spring spa box with free spa essentials. Go to genucel.com/Walsh, genucel.com/Walsh. It's also at the very best a gross oversimplification to accuse me of disavowing video games and social media. You have me on the anime point, however. As we all know, I do literally think that anime is demonic, and every single person who has ever watched it has become possessed by the devil. Literally, that's what I think. But for the rest of it, not so much. These were the most coherent and intelligent rebuttals to my tweet from half a decade ago. Most of the rest were like these. Conservatives returning to their cancel culture roots. Feels like the 1990s all over again. Don't be left-wing, don't be right-wing, have both wings and fly. Someone else said, how is playing video games any different than reading works of fiction, watching TV shows or movies or any other form of fictional entertainment? I swear, miserable people just want others to be equally as miserable as they are. Another one says, you can tell Matt's parents didn't get him a Nintendo or a Sega for Christmas when he was young. Such a sad childhood he must have had. Then someone else says, the life of Matt Walsh is empty. You could end his life and not a soul would mourn his passing. Well, if you want to prove my point that video games are a sacred cow in this country and many adults are far too invested in them, then wishing death on me for mildly criticizing some video games is definitely one way to do it. Also, same with the claim that a childhood without video games must have been sad. As it happens, I did have a Nintendo growing up, but most of my most cherished childhood memories have nothing to do with anything I played or watched on a screen. You know, I remember things like going on hikes in the woods with my dad, playing kickball out in the backyard, running around outside all day in the summer, drinking out of a garden hose, coming back for dinner, which was always homemade, and we always ate as a family around the dinner table. Those are the kinds of things that I remember. That's what I spent my childhood doing. How sad. What a sad childhood. Yeah, all that stuff is great, but you didn't spend enough time playing Mario. Really sad. Now, we've heard from everyone who misses the point, but what is the point exactly? Well, there are a few points that matter, I think. But you won't be able to hear them if you insist absolutely that no statements, even vaguely critical of video games, can ever be uttered in your presence. Okay, if video games are a religion for you, then there's not much I can say to get through to you. But for everybody else, here's what it boils down to. There is obviously nothing inherently wrong with video games as a medium. Okay, it's just another form of screen-based entertainment. And when it comes to our children and to ourselves too as adults, but we're just going to focus on children for now, the two things we have to take into consideration with screen-based entertainment of all kinds are, one, the messages embedded in the content, and two, the amount of time spent on the content. Now, as to the first point, I think all reasonable people understand that the screen is a very powerful messaging system. There's a reason why the corporate world spends literally billions of dollars every year marketing through the screen. They know that it's a very effective way to influence people, especially children. There are plenty of studies that prove this point if you're into that sort of thing, but you don't need a study. You're living in the study. You are the study. We live in a culture shaped by and around the screen. Go to any school and you'll find a building full of kids whose values, beliefs, priorities, tastes have been nearly completely determined by the content they spend their days ingesting through the screen. Video games are not the only example of this, or even the most potent example, but they also obviously aren't an exception. They're in that category. There are all kinds of ideas and images that kids encounter in astronomically large quantities every day. Graphic violence is one category. It's not good for kids to spend an exorbitant amount of time consuming graphically violent content, even if the content is fictional and virtual and imaginary. Okay, it doesn't mean that it has no influence just because it's fictional. Among other things, it can have the effect of desensitizing their minds and their souls to violence. And the kind of casual cruelty and violence that we so often see among kids today is a pretty good evidence of this desensitization. Like it kind of boggles my mind that anyone could hear an argument like this. Kids are being desensitized to violence. Then you hear people say, well, what do you mean? Where's your evidence of that? Where's my evidence of it? Look around you. What are you talking about? You're living in the evidence. Now, this doesn't mean that kids should never be exposed to any form of violence at all. Violence is part of the world. It's not always bad either. There's heroic violence. There's violence in defense of the innocent and so on. It's good for kids to be given examples of that kind of violence, even if the examples are sometimes fictional, even if they're cartoonish. Superheroes, for example, are an example of heroic violence. But when the violence is gratuitous and amoral and overly graphic, when it is violence for the sake of violence, when it's violence where the entertainment comes from simply watching someone suffer, even if in a fictional context, that is when it becomes a problem, especially for kids. There's a message in that kind of content too, and it's a message that undermines human dignity and desensitizes the viewer, especially if the viewer is a child. So I think we should be very careful about the kind of violence that kids are exposed to, whether it's through a film, a television, a show, a video on social media, or a video game. Second point, putting the quality of the content aside, which you really can't do because the quality through all of these mediums is so often garbage, but setting that aside, volume is the other great concern. Whether we're talking about social media, shows, movies, or games, kids are spending a huge portion of their formative childhood years staring at screens. They aren't having real childhood experiences. They aren't learning how to relate to each other and to the world. They're becoming fat and depressed. They can barely even speak to each other. They can't look you in the eye. They don't stand up straight. They're just staring down at the phone all the time. And all of this can be traced back to a life dedicated to these damned screens. This is why we don't do video games or phones or computers in our home with our 6 kids. It's not because we're afraid that they're going to, spontaneously combust if they ever hold a phone in their hand or play Minecraft or whatever, but it's because the screen is a tyrant. It demands obsessive attention, and it usually gets what it demands. There's an undeniable addictive quality to all this stuff, and most of us know that from experience. It's possible to moderate your own usage. It's possible to moderate your child's usage of the device. It's possible to moderate the kind of content they're exposed to on these devices. But the vast majority of parents fail to impose that kind of moderation. And that's why it seems more effective to us in my home and a sure bet to simply keep it all away for now. After all, our kids will have a whole lifetime in front of them to waste away staring at screens if that's how they choose to spend their adulthood. I hope they don't, but they can. When they're adults, they can do what they want. But they'll never be able to get this time back. They can never have a second childhood. As much as my generation might try to pull that off for ourselves, trying to have a second childhood, you can't actually do that. Our kids will have time for the screens, more than enough time, way too much time. For now, I want them to have a childhood. And whether you let your kids play video games or not, I hope you don't allow the video game or the TV or the phone to become their childhood. That's the issue. And that's why ultimately it's the parents who allow the screens to dominate their children's lives who are today canceled. That'll do it for us today. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Have a great day. Godspeed.